I've been building computers since 2011. I had a YouTube channel since 2013. And I've built almost all Intel builds up till 2017. In 2017, in March, I think it was March 2nd, AMD released Ryzen. Ryzen offered a huge IPC bump, a whole different architecture from bulldozer, pile drive, excavator, etc. They were actual cores, not these clusters. And the single thread performance made them perfectly fine for gaming. But they added a lot more actual cores, better multi-thread capability, and stuff like streaming, editing, stuff like that, and still good game performance. The problem with the first gen was they were slow. The IPCs were a bit behind, but they were slower. They were in like the mid-3s. And Intel responded with the 8000 series CPUs that were up in the upper 4s. 7000 series could overclock to mid to upper 4s, but your mileage may vary, right? And then Ryzen 2000 series came out with better power efficiency, slightly smaller die, and faster speeds. My 2700X had 4.2 gigahertz on all cores. And it was comparable with any other chip that was $300 Intel offered. So, I9-9900k, it wouldn't do quite as well in gaming. You'd lose anywhere from 10 to 15% because you could get an 8700K to 800 megahertz faster. But if you see my recent videos at the same speed, Intel and AMD were very close, about 5 to 8% difference on a per core basis. And then AMD announced this year Ryzen 3000 series. And their claims, which they say take with a grain of salt, but AMD is usually not too far off. They said a 15% IPC bump. They said that they can, at the same price point, match or beat Intel in gaming. I was a little bit skeptical saying that they would beat them, but I think they would bring them to a point where gaming was close enough and the extra multi-core performance would make it a clear-cut answer. So that's what we're doing today. Welcome to the Ryzen 9 3900X versus the Intel Core i9-9900k, the previous reigning champion for the best gaming CPU. Let's find out if after today it'll walk away with that title or if AMD will steal it away. So here are the test setups, pretty straightforward. We have the Core i9-9900k paired with a Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Elite. Under a Fractal Design S360 cooler. I am using my PC cooler fans for that. They are much better than anything else I have available. The memory was clocked at 3600 megahertz and it was running at that speed. We were running with the GTX 1080, 8 gigs of GDDR5 memory. EVGA G2 850 watt power supply, it's 80 plus gold. Open air bench, a Crucial P1 500 gig NVMe SSD. And then the only difference with the AMD build was the 3900X and the motherboard's MSI X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. So a few assumptions can be made. Most of the games were set on high settings. WoW was on level 8. For Honor was on extreme. But for the most part, we wanted to have good graphics, but we didn't really want to unload the CPU very much. We wanted to give it some realistic load. There weren't any outliers, but when there are, I always remove them, rerun, and verify. The programs running during gaming benchmarks is Hardware Monitor, MSI Afterburner, CPU-Z, and I have 4 Chrome tabs open, and one of them is actually playing Halo 3 on loop. It's a 10-hour version, as well as 3 other web pages. The following assumptions can be made across the board. Motion blur was off whenever available. The secondary display was 1080p, 1080 by 1920 vertical. Only use GPU boost precision, which boosts up to just a hair over 2000 megahertz on the core and just a hair over 10,000 megahertz on the memory. For stock, I did both Intel and AMD, and overclock was only Intel for almost every test. Some of the synthetics I overclocked, but for the most part didn't help. The auto overclock function was used for both platforms and for the memory. So 3600 megahertz worked perfectly fine, and I needed auto overclock within the motherboard. Fans were normalized to the motherboard default, and synthetics only had a few programs open, whereas the games had the multiple programs, as you saw in the last page. And also, the 9900K ran 4.7 gigahertz stock, because as soon as I turned it on with no BIOS changes, that's what it ran at. And for overclocked, I did manage to get it up to 5 gigahertz as well. It didn't thermal throttle, but it came very close. I need to put out a couple disclaimers. First things first, AMD could not overclock past 4.3 gigahertz. A lot of people are having issues with precision boost. I only overclocked on synthetics. For the final reporting, I only showed single threaded for Cinebench for stock, because that was the best one. AMD overdrive is not working. The i9 ran over 90 degrees Celsius in synthetics. The tests are normalized at 20 degrees, but it got as warm as 28 in the room. The wild tests were averaged from 2 runs, and I did a flight path into Zuldazar zone. So I did one direction and back. I actually ran these a few times to make sure the tests were pretty accurate. And I did omit the 1% lows. It got very cluttered in the chart. But I will say there weren't any outliers. Both of them performed plus or minus like 10-15% of each other. And the experience was pretty similar across the board for both platforms. I love me some Cinebench. I love saying that. I hate R20 single core. It takes so long to complete. But this was the first test I ran, and it gave me so much hope. 519 points single core, bone stock, versus 9900K's 514. Now the overclock went down. Here's the reason. As I mentioned, precision boost isn't working right. I got about 4.55 gigahertz precision boost. And when I did all-core overclock, went to 4.25-ish. So that just didn't help the single-core performance, so it dropped. Overclock, though, it definitely picked up some points. But it's really important to note that even in Cinebench R15, 207 versus 205 with the stock 9900K. So it beat the stock for stock, and even when you overclocked 9900K, it only lost by a few percentages. But multi-core, it won by a hair under 50% for R20 and a hair over 50% for R15. I find it interesting. Blender's not just a benchmark. It's a program that people use. But I digress. So the 9900K gained a little bit with some overclock, just under 20% of a minute. I think it was around 10 seconds, whereas AMD only gained, I think, like 2 or 3 seconds at most. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that all-core automatic overclock gets up to close to 4.2. And the fastest I could really give was 4.25, so it didn't help out much. But obviously a clear win here. 24 threads versus 16. I don't think that surprised anybody. So I decided to do Adobe. I felt that was a really, really important test, especially since that's important to me. And a decent win, but not as much of a win as I really hoped or expected. And I'm going to explain why based off of what I saw. The 9900K, both stock and overclocked, used 100% CPU. The 3900X used about 75 to 80%. And why I find that's interesting is it looks like Adobe is only going to pull so much resources. Now, the 3900X won, but it didn't win by what you would expect, which is approximately 50%. But what I really like about that is with my system, that allows me to free up resources to do other things while the video is exporting. Especially it's going to take 10 or 15 minutes if it's an 8 or 10 gigabyte file that we're working with. Nonetheless, still a clear win. I think it's a win we all expected, but learned a lot in the process as well. I am not sure at this point if you think you're looking at the numbers right. Linus did a video laughing about CSGO, how AMD won. And you're looking at another notoriously Intel favorite game and say, this makes no sense. GTA 5 has a frame limiting cap of 187.5 FPS. At 3900X at 1080p hit it, averaged it. and 1440p missed it by 2. It did better than a 9900K at stock, which I find incredible because unless you have really good culling, like a 360 rad or a really good 280, you're going to have to run at maximum 4.7. And the 3900X coming out, in my opinion, a win. The 9900K obviously overclock will overtake it, but this is really impressive. If you looked at previous GTA 5 videos with AMD wasn't that close. It really wasn't. Now this one was a little bit interesting. I ran this a few times and I was a bit surprised. I start off at 1440p and saw they were dead heat, dead tie. 1080p with WoW. The 9900K, definitely clear win. Nobody's going to argue that. And I'm not entirely sure why. WoW has an older design. It still really relies on single-threaded, which even though this processor can deliver, I think that it's going to take either an overhaul or a lot of updates to really utilize the new strengths of the 7nm platform. But what this also goes to tell you is buying a Ryzen 3000 series CPU is a very good choice for World of Warcraft in 2019. Previously, it was a compromise. I think nowadays, it's a good choice. Rise of the Tomb Raider has also historically been a little bit more Intel favored due to its just design. Not, talking poorly on the game, but close. 8 FPS, so roughly 4% behind stock and about 6% behind overclocked. So that's stock versus overclocked. So really, really impressive. Even less at a 1440p rather, but at 1080p, we're really starting to see Ryzen really start to stretch its legs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what all this means at the end. But let's look at, we have like 4 or 5 more games to take a look at. Ghost Recon Wildlands, really close. Could it potentially be up against a GPU bottleneck? But when we're up over 100 FPS at 1080p and up over 60, 70 FPS and 1440p, that's as far as I want to push it. Theoretical is not all that important to me. I really want to see real world results, and definitely at 1080p, it was a little better with the 9900K, just a few FPS, but man, they're really close. Another Ubisoft game, For Honor, really close. Intel won by margin of error, but when I reran these a few times, they were consistently edging out by anywhere from 1 to 3 FPS. So, going to give it to Intel, but again, that's really close. Really, really good performance from both CPUs. On the Division 2, very similar to the last couple charts. The 3900X did consistently post a smidget faster. This is an AMD favored game, though, at least from a graphics card standpoint, so doesn't surprise me, but the chips are doing really well here. Still going to call this a dead heat. The 9900K is a really hot CPU. Now, part of that is the fact that I haven't really been able to successfully overclock the 3900X to get any kind of meaningful improvements. The 3900X pulled a little under 150 watts under full load. The 9900K at stock was pulling around there at 4.7 gigahertz, and overclocked the 5 gigahertz was around 190. It was running so hot that when I originally ran an H100i, it was thermal throttling in synthetics, and at 4.7, it almost thermal throttled, which is why I upgraded to a 360 rad with better fans. Mind you, though, it was a bit warmer. When I ran Intel, it was about 28 degrees in the room, and when I ran Ryzen, it was around 24. And I did adjust everything down to 20 degrees ambient. So the 3900X topped out at like 82, whereas the 9900K hit like 99 on the hottest core at one point, running synthetics. And gaming, it was in the 80s. So it's a really powerful CPU, but man, does it generate a lot of heat. So this is stock Intel versus AMD essentially at stock. Well, actually all the results from stock. From a gaming standpoint, you see on average, Intel at stock squeezed out less than a 2% win. In synthetics, it fell just under 18% behind, and overall, it was behind by about 8%. Now, we're going to take a look at the overclocked benchmark or results in a second. But if you remember from my older charts, I don't think AMD got even above 94, 93%, and that was against locked Intel CPUs. It's very important to note that the AMD CPU is running significantly slower in this scenario. Maximum single core clock was about 4.55 gigahertz versus Intel's 5 gigahertz. With that said, Intel won by less, just a hair under 4% in the gaming benchmarks. But Intel lost by over 15% in the synthetic benchmarks. From an overall standpoint, 100% being the best option, AMD is about 97.5% and Intel is a little bit under 92.5%. And this is interesting because before you had to give up anywhere from 5 to 10% of gaming when you overclock the snot out of these CPUs that match an Intel locked CPU. Now, the best of the best, a 5 gigahertz CPU is less than 4% better in gaming than a CPU that is running approximately 500 megahertz slower. Now, to understand this chart and the next chart, we're going to start at the bottom, the red, which is cost value. Assuming the Intel system costs $2,000, which is pretty close to what that may run, the AMD system would actually run $2,070. At Micro Center, at least, the CPU is $50 more, and the Aorus Elite on X570, for example, is $20 more. So AMD actually loses in value. That's why the number is lower, because I did the inverse, essentially. So starting out from there, what I did was I took Intel's having a better value of 100% and multiplied it by the previous results, which is why the workload went up, why the total value went up. The gaming essentially stayed the same for Intel. But AMD actually dropped because technically AMD being more expensive is going to deliver less value in comparison to not taking that consideration. From a workload standpoint, it still wins. From a total value standpoint, it still wins. From a gaming value standpoint, it's 2.5% behind. And that I wanted to show everybody because we always talk about AMD is cheaper and does it better. AMD is more expensive and does it just as good and better. But wait, what about overclocking? I got you there. So Intel is still cheaper. Technically, yes, AMD has a stock cooler. I understand that. But eventually, in pulling out 140 watts, a stock cooler is not rated for. So I don't see anybody buying a 9300K with a stock cooler for long term. You're going to get a better aftermarket cooler. You can make the argument 9900K requires an even better aftermarket cooler because it consumes a lot more power, but we don't know that yet. So we're just going to assume that you're buying the same system. Even when overclocked, obviously value workload is roughly a little bit worse. Gaming or total value is a little bit worse, but still wins out. And gaming is a smidgen worse. But total value still squeaks out by almost 1% because you're a little bit behind in gaming when you overclock just due to the limitations we're dealing with, but you're still a fair bit better in other workloads, heavy tasks. So that's it. Let's wrap this up and tell you my full final thoughts. So who walks away with the crown? AMD, Intel. It's too close to call. We need to do this again. Couple reasons. Precision boost overdrive's not working right. My CPU is supposed to run to 4.6 gigahertz. According to Robert from AMD, my CPU should be able to hit 4.8 with just precision boost overdrive with adequate cooling, which I had. But I only hit 4.55. Now, yeah, it's an up on AMD. The launch wasn't great. I get that, but with the data we have today, they're so close in gaming. And yes, Intel did win, but they're so close in gaming, it's hard to just let Intel leave with the crown. Technically, they are. They're going to leave with it. But we're going to revisit this in a few weeks, maybe a month or two, when AMD works out some quirks. But what's interesting is when you look at single-threaded performance, 4.55 versus, say, a stock 9900K that ran at 4.7. It's not running a 3.6. It's running a 4.7. AMD on both R15 and R20 Cinebench outperformed it in single-threaded. The only time 9900K won was in R15, overclocked another 300 megahertz, and it won by, like, I think 10 or 11 points. Which, when you're at this level, isn't that big of a deal. So, right now, I'm about to test the 3600 versus 9600K. We are at a point where I ran the games not the highest settings, but decent detail. And running at 720p low is ridiculous. Let me explain. Other than the bulldozer architecture, that's never been relevant. Games are designed more so towards Intel's design and AMD because the bulldozer, pile driver, excavator was so garbage. I'm not blaming game developers for doing that at all. And keep developing the way you want, but I think they're going to start developing in a way that's really not going to lean one way or another. And newer games and patches that come out, you're going to see even more performance from the 3900X. And given the fact that it's performing better per core at a slower speed than Intel is, I think in the future 3900X, if we were to go 2 years down the road, will actually run better than 9900K. CSGO, for example, I didn't run it, but Linus did. The 3900X won, because that's a very simplistic, nothing but single core, it's all that matters. It won, right? Sure, World of Warcraft at 1080p did, I get that. GTA 5, they both capped out. But we're at a point where you could buy both processors, a top-end graphics card, run 1440p, and both of them are going to return more or less with the settings you want, the exact same performance, plus or minus 1%. But then, the 9900K does not have the multi-core performance that the 3900X does. It just doesn't. And in my opinion, Intel, you're going to really want to work on 10 nanometer. I wouldn't rush it out. Sure, a lot of people are going to go Ryzen. Anybody build a new system should probably go Ryzen. Maybe not now, but in like a month or two. I don't see Intel offering a better chip at any price point when they're comparing against Ryzen 3000 series, unless they reduce the prices. I just don't see it. But what's going to be interesting is when Intel goes 10 nanometer and then AMD refines their 7 nanometer roughly at the same time, that's going to be the interesting battle. Is Intel going to be able to pull back ahead? You're walking away with the crown today, but barely. I'm not saying go out and buy Ryzen today. There are some issues, but nothing that prevents you from gaming or even using it. Just a couple like tweaking issues. 3600 megahertz RAM worked right out of the box. XMP never had a blue screen. Now I probably will. But I recommend it. Thank you for tuning in to this video of the 3900X versus the 9900K. He may have walked away with the crown, but we're bringing him back in a few weeks here, and I think he's going to give it up. Like the video if you liked it, dislike if you dislike, leave a comment, get subscribed. Email me info@pcbudgetsolutions.com. Buy stuff from Amazon listed, link below. And as always, this is Steve from PC Budget Solutions, and me and my 3900X. We'll see you all later on down the road.